Welcome to another episode of the Robinson-Hewitt Pod. This is where we talk about the future of technology and what it will mean to be human in the next era of tech. I'm your host, Alison Mackey. I'm a futurist, anthropologist of emerging technology, and founder of Robinson-Hewitt Consulting. Welcome. So before ChatGPT or AI was in the mainstream, when I would advise on the future of technology behind closed doors, I used to explain the use cases I envisioned for how it would operate in our day-to-day lives and what we would need to do to build it. And usually this was to people that weren't necessarily needing to know the tech side of things, just needed to understand the general impact of where we were going in terms of technology. And so I would describe this vision of an AIOS, an artificial intelligence operating system. And I would say, imagine you want to take a young woman out on a date and you'd go to your AIOS and you'd say, hey, I finally got the courage to ask that girl out. Can you organize everything for me? And so the AIOS goes and checks her calendar, books the restaurant, double checks the weather, sees it's going to turn, and so it books an Uber so that she doesn't have to walk in the rain. And while it's doing all that, it also notices in your calendar that it's been a few weeks since your last haircut, and so it books that too. So you didn't type anything. You didn't need to open 5 apps. It just happened seamlessly in the background and intuitively, as if you were already the greatest date she's ever been on. And when I used to describe that, people would kind of smile and nod, but I would also get a lot of, yeah, right, not in this lifetime. Well, I used to say this back in my 2013 contemporary anthropology essays, and then as I grew in my career, I started saying this to people who could actually start pulling the levers on making this reality, both in a technical sense, but also in a policy sense. But that was a couple of years ago, and the thing is, we're on the brink of it, and I suspect that we're just around the corner. The technology to make this possible isn't waiting to be invented, because it already exists right now. What we're building towards is the layer that connects it all together. So this is the trusted network, the hardware and the software working in sync, and the background intelligence that makes it feel less transactional and more like something that just takes care of itself. So that's what I want to talk about today. It's ambient AI. And not AI like a chatbot, but AI as a layer of intelligence woven into the physical world around us, the kind that we don't notice because it's just working seamlessly and intuitively. And this episode has actually been waiting to be made for a little while. In the Future of Energy episode, I touched on the idea of the grid becoming intelligent, about hardware and software converging, about the intersection of the physical and the digital as being one of the most interesting places to build right now. And I kept running out of time within so many episodes to get to this and talk about it from a human level. So here we are today. So we're going to be talking about what ambient AI actually means and what history can tell us about transitions like this and why we need community consensus when we build this as well. And that's usually the missing piece we have when it comes to transitions in technology. Okay, so let's take a little look into the current state of play when it comes to AI. So most people and most organizations, to be honest, are still treating AI like a software story, something that lives purely on a platform and behind a login screen that you only go to when you need it. And that is just one version, but it's the early version, and it's a little bit clunky compared to where we're going. But the direction where all of this is heading towards is something much more embedded than that. And I'm not just talking about AI popping into your Gmail type of embedded. This is so much more than that. What I'm talking about is AI that lives in this liminal space environment. AI that is present in devices, infrastructure, buildings, supply chains, and services without anyone having to consciously activate it. And it moves between each node on the network, creating a mesh of seamless, intuitive intelligence where information can jump and dot around where it needs to go and collect what is required. That's ambient AI, intelligence as an operating layer rather than just an application. Almost like how when chatbot screens different web pages for information, this version does something similar. But instead, it's screening different networks, platforms, and spaces in our physical environments autonomously. And there are a few things colliding right now that make this conversation imperative. And the first is energy. I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating because it is foundational. AI runs on data centers, and data centers run on enormous amounts of electricity, as well as water. And the biggest tech companies in the world right now are suddenly investing heavily in energy infrastructure and renewable generation. And that's not a coincidence. The future of AI is physically constrained by the future of electricity. And a reminder to those who aren't familiar with RHC, we are also developing a water project as a solution for equitable access to water, which directly addresses water allocation as well as the future of water stewardship. If you want more information about that, everything will be linked below. But back to ambient AI. The thing is, you cannot have always-on ambient intelligence without always-on reliable power. But energy is only one part of the story. The other part that the world is becoming increasingly instrumented with are sensors and smart devices. It's the connected infrastructure. But over the last 15 years, we've seen an increase of this in our homes, in our hospitals, factories, vehicles, and cities, where we are generating data constantly. And in many cases, a lot of places around the world already have the sensory layer needed for ambient intelligence. But what's interesting is that the challenge is no longer about collecting data. The challenge is integration. And most of these systems operate independently. So the thermostat doesn't know what's happening within the energy market, and the building management system doesn't understand what's happening in the transport space. Medical devices, logistics systems, utility networks, and consumer platforms often exist entirely in separate worlds. And from an anthropological perspective, this is a very familiar pattern. Every major infrastructure transition goes through a period where the infrastructure exists before society fully understands how to integrate it. We had electricity before we had appliances designed around it. We had the internet before we had platforms that knew how to use it. And today we have AI connected devices, intelligent infrastructure, and increasingly intelligent energy systems. What we're missing is the connective layer that allows them to operate as one coherent whole. But that's what ambient AI really is. It's not one technology. It's the convergence of sensing, intelligence, and the ability for systems to understand what is happening, to make decisions, and respond in the physical world. Which brings us to the third collision happening right now, with the movement from digital AI to physical AI. And if you heard last week's episode on the future of energy, you know that I love this sweet spot between the physical and the digital worlds. So most organizations still think about AI through the screen with models, prompts, interfaces, and outputs. But physical AI is different because it's the point where intelligence stops simply processing information and starts interacting with the real world. And that's through our sensors, devices, infrastructure, robots, buildings, and networks. We've been through this. But the moment AI begins sensing and acting in the physical world, the stakes change. Questions around governance, accountability, trust, data ownership, and resilience become far more important, because we're no longer talking about a tool that we use to optimize your work or life, or ask that weird question that you wouldn't ask any other human. We're talking about intelligence becoming part of the environment itself. And of course, if we want to take a look into the future, we have to take a little look back in time to notice the patterns. So this has happened before, not with AI, obviously, but the shape of the transition is familiar. So when electricity first arrived, it was a total event. People actually went somewhere to experience it. The arc of lights in cities were a spectacle, and people traveled to see them. Electricity was something that existed only in specific places, and it was remarkable. But then over the course of a few decades, it became infrastructure. It moved into factories first, then into our homes, and then into the background. And once it moved into the background, people actually stopped thinking about it as electricity, as a sort of technology. They just thought about light, heat, refrigeration. The tech dissolved into the environment, but what remained was the capability it enabled. So you don't think about the electrical system, you just turn on the switch and the light turns on, right? And that disappearance, that moment when a technology stops being the thing that you notice and starts being the thing that everything else depends on, is one of the most significant moments in any technological transition. And we do have this tendency to forget how disorientating those transitions were at the time. There were serious debates about whether electricity in the home was safe, whether it was appropriate, whether it belonged there at all. And there were entire industries built around gaslighting that were not thrilled about what was coming. There were people who thought that the whole thing was moving far too fast. And then there were some people who thought that they weren't moving fast at all. And the places that got it right, the cities and industries that managed this transition well, weren't necessarily the ones that moved the fastest. They were the ones that built the infrastructure thoughtfully, that figured out the standards, and that solved for distribution, not just generation. So in the last episode on the future of energy, we mentioned that Edison built the first commercial power station in New York in 1882, and it was centralized, local, and relatively contained. But what came after that was AC, alternating current. The systems that Tesla and Westinghouse championed, which were bigger, more distributed, and ultimately more scalable. And the argument between those two models weren't just technical. It was a disagreement about how the future should be structured, who controls it, and where the power lives, literally and otherwise. And honestly, I think we're having the exact same argument right now about AI. Centralized versus distributed, controlled by a few large platforms versus built across open, interoperable networks. And the pattern from the electricity transition suggests that the more distributed model tends to win over time because resilience and scale both depend on it. But the centralized model tends to be the one that is established first because it is easier to build and easier to control. So the question isn't really who wins. I think it's more about how much of the infrastructure gets locked in before the distributed model arrives and how hard it will become to change the course. The other pattern worth noticing is that the most transformative applications of electricity weren't the obvious ones. Everyone predicted better lighting, but not everyone predicted the electric motor changing manufacturing, refrigeration changing food systems, or the elevator making skyscrapers possible. The technology enabled things that had nothing obvious to do with electricity itself. And that's how I think ambient AI will work too. I think the most transformative applications will probably not be the ones that we're currently imagining. I think they'll be the ones that become possible once intelligence is there in the environment, running everything underneath it. And maybe it will tell us itself. That's some food for thought. So what is my futuristic insights? Tell me about the future of ambient AI. So what does it actually look like? What is the world where ambient AI is working the same way electricity works today? It's just present, just functional, just the condition that everything else depends on. The most important shift is that physical and digital stop being two separate categories. Right now, most of us move between a physical space and a digital space. We pick up our phone and we enter the digital, we put it down and step back into the physical. But I think the ambient AI future is one where that boundary is a little bit blurred. So the physical environment is responsive. It senses, processes, and adapts in the way that a well-run building knows when to adjust temperature, when to optimize energy, or when a system needs maintenance before it even fails. And the infrastructure for this is the three things that I've been talking about in my work for years. IoT, the Internet of Things, which is the sensory layer. AI, which is the processing layer, and decentralization, which is the structural layer. Because a truly ambient system can't rely on a single centralized point. It has to be distributed enough to be resilient. So if one node fails, the system can adapt. And this isn't necessarily blockchain in general. I want to be clear about that. I believe in a future where we don't actually truly marry ourselves to one type of model, but I think the value system matters here because the principle of decentralization matters enormously for building something that is robust and trustworthy at scale. But the deeper point is that these three layers aren't enough on their own. They describe capability but not coherence. So what we're actually missing is the orchestration layer, the thing that allows the sensing, the intelligence, and the impact of all of this to behave as a system rather than fragmented parts. And this is where I want to tie it all back to an episode on smart cities because it's totally relevant here and it always is. So we talked about cities as a living system that can respond to what is actually happening. And we can see a shift with things like traffic routing that adjusts in real time based on conditions, not schedules, buildings that manage their own energy consumption intelligently, and infrastructure that can flag its own faults before they become failures, as well as emergency systems that can reroute and adapt when needed. But then there's also the identity and exchange layer, which is one of the most under-discussed foundations of all of this and probably the most contested. For the ambient AI vision to work, for the version where your AI OS is coordinating across restaurants, calendars, logistics, services, and physical actions, there has to be a trusted layer of identity and exchange underneath all of it. So how do the systems know you have authorized something, not just logged in, but actually permitted action in the physical world? How does payments move across systems that are no longer app-bound? And how does a service know it's actually interacting with you consistently across environments, devices, and contexts without constantly re-verifying you in fragmented ways? This is where digital ID becomes foundational infrastructure, not an application feature. A persistent, portable identity layer that is not scattered across institutions, but unified and user-controlled. And alongside that, a payment layer that can operate continuously in the background, not as transactions that you initiate, but as permissioned flows that execute when conditions are met. And I'm not talking about crypto here either. I'm talking more about stable digital value rails that can operate with trust, predictability, and governance built in. Systems that allow exchange to happen without friction, but still has accountability. And then I think there's still other things that are subtle underneath all of this as well, which is data permissioning. Not just ownership of data, but granular control over how it's used, when it's accessed, and by which systems. Because in an ambient system, data is no longer something that you just log into. It is something that is continuously circulating around environments. It's truly in this liminal space. And so this means that you have have to consent to something to become continuous and programmable, not static and buried within terms and conditions. And the piece that sits underneath all of this is still energy, the reliable, distributed, intelligent energy systems. Because as we said before, we cannot have always-on ambient intelligence without always-on power. Oh my gosh. And you cannot scale that without a grid itself becoming intelligent, able to reroute, balance, and integrate distributed generation in real time. And this is the part that I think kind of gets overlooked sometimes. Energy is not just an input into AI systems. Energy, computation, sensing, identity, and exchange are all starting to converge into one infrastructural stack. So the same system that powers intelligence is the same system that enables movement, trust, and action in the physical world. And energy and intelligence are not parallel tracks. They are converging layers of the same system. So all of this is huge. So let's bring it in today and see the actions we can take to build this future. So for people building in the space, whether you're in technology, energy, infrastructure, urban planning, or anywhere that sits in the physical and digital intersection, the first thing that I would do is stop treating AI as just a screen problem. If your AI strategy begins and ends with a model that you access through an interface, then you're thinking about half the picture here. Start asking what it looks like when intelligence moves off the screen. Where are the physical touch points in your system? Where are your sensors? What's happening when the decisions have real world consequences? And these questions require different thinking. They require different governance and different kinds of expertise than purely digital AI implementation. So how do you keep your network and data safe? That's the big one. The second thing for builders and organizations is to take standards seriously now before the infrastructure is locked in. The electricity analogy is very useful here. So a lot of the electrical infrastructure back in the day had to be rebuilt because it was built to incompatible standards, and the cost of that was enormous, and it slowed things down significantly. The interoperability question of how do different ambient AI systems, different devices, different networks talk to each other is not a detail to figure out later. It is a foundational design decision today, and it is much easier to get it right at the start than to retrofit later on. But for individuals, the most valuable thing that you can do right now is to update your mental model of what AI is. If you still think of AI as just simply a chatbot, then you are working with a definition that is about to become a little bit limited. So start noticing the places where intelligence is already embedded in your physical environment. Think about your phone's ability to predict what you need, your home devices that respond to conditions, the apps that operate in the background without you actively using them. That is very early versions of ambient AI. It is already around you, and noticing is the first step to having more informed relationships about where this is all going. And the other thing for individuals, which I know can feel very abstract, is to start thinking about your own data and your identity as something worth having a position on. The ambient AI future runs on data, and it runs on systems knowing things about you. And right now, most people's data is scattered across institutions, platforms, and services in ways that you have no visibility into and very little control over. And that is going to matter more and not less as intelligence becomes more embedded in everyday life. So knowing where your data lives and how it is used is not paranoia. I think it's just being an informed participant in a system that you're a part of. And I have a favorite quote from Charlie Chaplin from his first talkie film, The Great Dictator. At the end, he says, "You, the people, have the power." And I think it's really relevant to actually watch the whole speech when it comes to this conversation. It's very relevant, so I'll link it below. And honestly, for those who want to dive deeper into the individual level of all of this, we have a previous episode on AI and consensus, and the idea of playing around with the idea of having a public referendum when it comes to AI. So this was a follow-up episode to our How to Build Ethical AGI episode. So there's heaps to dive into if you're really curious about how we approach all of this here at RHC. So there is so much to this episode that we didn't even get into. The governance sides of ambient AI, specifically what it means when AI moves from being a tool to being a functional actor in the world, and what structures we need in place before that happens. But the thing that I want to leave you with today is this. The most significant technologies in history are the ones that eventually disappear. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded completely, that they stopped being remarkable. And I think to some of us, electricity has stopped being remarkable. I think they've just become conditions of life as we know it. And I think remembering why it's remarkable is really important right now. So ambient AI is heading to that same place. And the decisions that are being made right now about how it's built, who controls it, what standards it runs on, what it knows about you and what it doesn't, those decisions are being made before most people are even paying attention. And the time to be paying attention is right now. not once it's already everywhere and invisible. Remember, you the people have the power. So if today's episode got you thinking, you can come and join your journey with us. We post nearly every day on Instagram. We post our insights and daily inspirations for founders and future-facing leaders. It's a good place to stay curious. And if you're ready to go deeper, you can head over to our website at RobinsonHewitt.com. We work at the intersection of anthropology, emerging technology, and long-term systems change, helping future-facing leaders and businesses and founders transform, evolve, and build the next era. If you're still orienting, we have so many free resources available to help you on your own founder's journey. But if you're ready to take the leap, you can check out our services as well. Make sure to subscribe to check out next week's episode to help build a better future for everyone. Everything is linked below, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao.